And today we have Christina Hutchins with us. She's going to be speaking on what language shall we borrow, proposing with the feeling for the life of the world. That is an alluring title, Christina, and it is also one that plants the seed so that we know that what's coming is going to be complex and fascinating.
Yes.
Christina Hutchins is a poet and process philosopher and theologian. You're gonna discover soon that she's a woman of many talents. In her undergraduate degree, she studied biochemistry and piano performance. So she's always been both an analyst, a conceptual analyst, and an artist, and she still is. She's a poet and philosopher, and she will share with us today. She has taught at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley for 18 years, lecturing in theology and the literary arts. She's also worked as a biochemist and congregational minister, and she says that she continues to have that ministerial touch to her work. She is both pastoral and passionate about goodness and the multiplication of goodness in the world. She's poet laureate of the Cobb Institute, and she presently teaches privately and leads retreats, preaches, and continues to write her poetry. Two of her books have received prizes. The names of the books are The Tender Maker, which received the Swinson Award, and the other is The Stranger Dissolves, which was a finalist for the Lambda Award. This is just a tiny sampling. She also writes essays, and she's published poems in many, many journals. She's just an accomplished woman, but that's enough for me. What you need to know is that she's a wonderful human being, and we are lucky to have her presence with us today. Thanks so much. Christina, you're on.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Mary Elizabeth, for the invitation. I love to think further about this stuff, and I've been very bothered, I guess, concerned by what's happening to language lately. And so it's good for me to think through it. And I just have to say one thing before I start about one of the books is The Stranger Dissolves. And right before I went on Zoom, I got a text from a friend, and it was her baby, who's 1 year old, holding the book and reading it, but not reading it, probably chewing on it. And so it's kind of a good metaphor for the what we're going to do. We're going to chew on poetry a little bit. So I have a few quotes to start with that are just sort of in general relation to our topic. The first one's from James Baldwin, the novelist. Though we do not wholly believe it yet, the interior life is a real life, and the intangible dreams of people have a tangible effect on the world. So that's a sense of where inner experience is having effects on the world. And this one, I love this quote. I must love this poor earth because I have seen no other. Osip Mandelstam, who's a poet. So where we're going is we're going to talk about betrayals of language in the current age, and then have a little experience about feeling the passage of time, and then dive into perception in the mode of presentational immediacy and causal efficacy. And I'm apologizing right now, those words are going to come up over and over, and they're kind of bulky. So, and then talk about poetry and perception in this particular mode, and then about what it is to think in this other mode, which, as you will see, is a little bit complicated. And then just kind of close our thoughts. And then I'm going to read just a few poems. So before also I start, I just want to say a word about familiarity with poetry, or strangeness of it to you, which it's a different way of using language, a language that you already know and have facility with, but it's actually a different language within a language. And one learns through time and by reading and being with poems sort of how to decipher them. And it's not about getting a poem, it's about experiencing it. So you might not be used to doing that, or you might have been exposed to poetry that does not move you. There, a former president of Pacific School of Religion, where I taught for a long time, every single time he saw me in the hall, he said, "I don't have a poetic bone in my body." And he must have said it, I don't know, 80 times. And I could never tell if he was ashamed about that or proud of it. So anyway, I invite you to be at ease. And this is not an apologetic for poetry. It might seem like it. It kind of is, though, for a certain kind of perception in which poetry is not just an ornament in how we communicate, but something important. So betrayals of language. We're life involved in language, which means that languages reveal how we perceive the world. And at the very same time, as we're using language, we're shaping how the world and how human beings are perceived. And languages are always changing. And at present, the change is very rapid, as you might guess. So I've been reading about large declines in vocabulary, especially among American adults who have all levels of education, with the highest decline being among people with the highest degree of education, which is interesting. But one of the best articles is by Jean Twenge, who teaches at San Diego State, and Keith Campbell at University of Georgia. And they examined trends over the past 50 years with a really careful methodology. And what they found was a diminishment in reading books. And they explored that as one cause. And then they looked at screen time and the immediacies that visual culture has and what that does to attention, et cetera. But their main insight was that vocabularies are smaller and they tend to be much narrower. They're not in the fields that they pertain to. The subjects are fewer. And then in addition, syntax, our grammar is simpler. And this matters because vocabulary is a major component of verbal intelligence by which we think, by which we do our politics. And so a larger and more nuanced vocabulary is, and also complex grammar, it expands what's possible to communicate and how exactingly that we can do it. It opens up choices of words that have different effects and valences. And so by doing that, our vocabulary is a tool with which we can expand or limit the complexity with which we can think. And my favorite essay of what I've read is by a high school senior, Charlotte Feller. This is an amazing essay for a person in high school. She surveyed students and teachers and professors, lots of them, and she describes students reading more on screens than they do in any other way, which we kind of know. And most students preferred a summary of a text or idea than an actual text or thinking about an idea. And what they struggled with was the voice of a text, because it differed from the direct and informational mode that they were used to online. That is a very simple, often transactional kind of communication. They were troubled by different tenses and by vocabulary that they thought was ornate and that they never look up, which was interesting to me. And some students had arrived at college not having finished a single book in their life. And some had not ever been assigned a full book to read. So Charlotte Feller writes, student writing is locked into using such a finite amount of simple words. It's that they have such a finite amount of simple words, a desire to write using the same words constantly used online. And her comment is, there's not much of a diversity in those words. And so she encourages teachers and professors to elevate their language and work on communicating complexity. So besides besides vocabulary and excuse me, and what technology kind of is doing to us, there's another thing that's betraying language, and that is our politics. More than ever, I think, that I can think of, language use is setting abstract descriptors over or on top of, instead of, actuality in highly repetitive ways. And so an example is this past weekend, there were 2,200 No Kings marches all over the country, some in rural areas. And millions of protesters were well organized by their local people. And they were all nonviolent. I was with 10,000 people over that, protesting in Oakland. And it was 100% peaceful. And not only that, there was a feeling of shared kindness and noticing of each other. At one point, and a person next to me reached out to catch me. It was pretty amazing. So I experienced the democratic we of community spirit. The president immediately called the protests terrible, terrible, violence everywhere. And this is a quote, all over the country, horrible destruction, horrible. So that's the contrast between a giant, wholly relational, widely felt shared event and a demeaning set of abstractions that are set over it by the president. And that's quite a violent act. So Adrienne Rich, who you probably know was a lesbian feminist poet in the 20th century, late 20th century, and a little bit this century. She wrote, if you love language and see it being betrayed, if you feel a huge gap between what you're told is going on and what you actually see and feel on your nerves, then this is the material of your art. There's no escaping it. So now we're moving to a heading called Feeling the Passage of Time, and there's nothing under it. And the reason is because we're going to have a little experience, maybe. But getting there is, I just want to say, the richness of language and the possibilities that enables. They are presently being curtailed by vocabulary loss, aversion to complexity, and by politically violent abstractions taking the place of actuality. So now I'm going to invite you to let go of that bad news for a little bit. And if you're game for a different kind of reflection, I invite you, you can close your eyes if you like or not. But I'm just going to sort of guide you a little bit in your imagination. So if you could forget all about language for a bit, because here you are in a 4-story aging building you've never been in. You decide to take the stairs up a few flights instead of the elevator. When the door squeaks open, the stairwell seems to have been closed all night. Yesterday is still there. There's warm air still trapped. There's a quality to the air, like a stuffiness. And what is that scent? It evokes an odd feeling in you, something very personal. A faintly but definitely recognized smell. But it's more than that you feel. So you pause and it comes to you, oh, it's the smell of my kindergarten classroom. So many years ago, that room, but the exact same smell. And then quick images arrive. There's coats on pegs, paper curling off a crayon, the feel of paste on a finger, the taste of it, some softness around your teacher, and duck, duck, tapping heads, feeling the warm sun on people's hair, duck, 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 goose. Then it's gone. But that experience in the stairwell now becomes its own memory because it was something strange and unusual. And in that instant, you had the inscrutable feeling of the actual passage of time. So a mode of perception now is holding that stairwell. We're moving out of the stairwell. Now holds that stairwell event and the kindergarten, both, even at the same time. And between them, there's this felt quickening that's both distant and close, and something in the experience in the stairwell is reassuring underneath, or maybe it's troubling. But even though we don't talk much about such moments, they happen and we often don't notice them, even though they are actually quite large. So Whitehead loved writing about perception. And he also wrote that language and perception are closely linked. And so for us, if language usage is suffering diminishment, it's good to ask what is happening to how we're now perceiving the world and each other. How are we perceiving the redwood grove we walk into? I mean, do we take a picture and leave? How do we perceive a public swimming pool? The blue rectangle that swarmed with children on a hot day? Or how do we perceive educational institutions or a shifting climate that outpaces us? Or a war? Alfred North Whitehead theorizes 2 modes of perception. One of them is presentational immediacy, and the other causal efficacy. So our ordinary habits of communications mostly involve presentational immediacy. And Perception in that mode is what happens when a child is learning to talk. They point to the dog on the page of a picture book and say dog. And then when they see a dog on the street, dog, there it is. So the pleasure of recognition is held in language for a little while. And there's an ordering of the world. It's a kind of necessary categorization, but we forget, I think, that it's a categorization that is in our ordinary ways of talking about things and each other. So Whitehead wrote, clarity is obtained only to ordinary perception through the senses. This mode of perception here termed presentational immediacy. So presentational immediacy is perceiving by those, by means of groups and categories and tables and chairs, not the constant buzz of becoming that is the atomistic relational world of physics that is the universe and finds its forms instant by instant. Nor is presentational immediacy able to perceive what is being vaguely felt in the stairway. So we often seem to need to have somewhere to fit things in language. Like, is that a weird spoon? What is it? What's it for? We want identity and defined purpose. And unfortunately, we do that to each other too. Presentational immediacy, this is Whitehead again, presupposes that the actual world, insofar as it is a community of entities which are settled, actual, and already become, conditions and limits the potentiality for creativity beyond itself. This given world provides data in the form of objectifications. So we depend on this mode of perception to denote the most ordinary things, as well as abstractions we use to think. And we characterize and we label them. Perceptions in the mode of presentational immediacy provide the manageable elements of our perceptions of the world, he says, in modes of thought. And that's where the danger comes in too. Managing and ordering of perceptions can harm life or ignore some lives. All sorts of harm can be done, as well as managing our perceptions can help life. But I think the danger might be a little bit bigger of being part of a mode that is about control, which is really what with that kind of language, objectification of the dog is about gaining control, which is not a bad thing. It's just that it's a dangerous thing. So the next thing is causal efficacy, perception in the mode of causal efficacy. And that's the other form of encountering the world for Whitehead. And it's a little bit trickier to verbalize, or a lot trickier. And Whitehead calls it vague, massive, a how of feeling rather than a what. So the time in the stairwell, that was perceiving in the mode of causal efficacy. If we were in person and you weren't allergic to grass, we could go lie in the grass together and look up, fall up into the passage of clouds. The grass would be sort of tickly maybe, but what passed through us would be just wordless. And then when you stand up, when each of us stands up, there's the shape of your body and my body pressed into the grass. So the time that you spent there shows. And grass blades have cross-hatched askew in the skin of your arm. And perception in the mode of causal efficacy then involves feeling the world becoming and extending itself and belonging to that interpenetrating through time of extension. So it's not things, it's not even trees or grass or people or clouds, it's events, the conjunctions that are the nodes of actual relation. And they're irreplaceable, these conjunctions. And I love this passage from Whitehead. In the dark, there are vague presences doubtfully feared. In the silence, the irresistible causal efficacy of nature presses itself upon us. In the vagueness of the low hum of insects in an August woodland, the inflow into ourselves of feelings from enveloping nature overwhelms us in the dim consciousness of half sleep. The presentations of sense fade away, and we are left with the vague feelings of influences from vague things around us. You'll notice the word vague keeps coming up. So these two different modes, we need them both. The child with the picture book pointing at animals with a single finger, naming their objectifications, their categories, their objectness, by which they're recognized clearly and in language, that child is perceiving in the mode of presentational immediacy. But maybe that child is sharing that picture book on a trustable lap. Maybe there's a voice that's warm and thick as oatmeal around the words that the child is learning. In a moment of connection, there's a constellation of the voice, the way the artist drew that dog, the joy of recognition of the child, their impatience for the next page. So reading with a child involves both perception as presentational immediacy and causal efficacy. And it's the causal efficacy that it's the lure that pulls us deeper into reading, which is why reading with children is so important. So I'd guess that though the word dog is going to be used over and over in that child's life, if the child remembers, either consciously or not, that moment later, it will be some hazy feeling that's a conglomeration of the lap, the voice, the caress, the shadows dappling the room as they lay their head back and put their thumb in their mouth. So it's not, causal efficacy is not the story of that moment. It's not a narrative, it's not linear. But it's that memory that surfaces later. And when it does, it might be an experience of feeling the actual passage of time vaguely and irrefutably, because that event is in you and it's not in you, it's no longer. So memory lies within memory because we start remembering the remembering. And there's a felt thickness to actuality, the world composing itself through our lifetimes and then before and beyond. In the book Symbolism, Whitehead writes, the contrast between the comparative emptiness of presentational immediacy, the comparative emptiness of it, and the deep significance disclosed by causal efficacy is at the root of the pathos which haunts the world. The world disclosed in its causal efficacy, where each event infects the ages to come for good or evil with its own individuality. And that individuality that is reaching through time to come, it's not a person that lasts. What it is it's a constellation, a conjunction that is where feeling is intense and kind of unified, and where something creative comes from it, and we don't even know that we're creating something. So I want to move to poetry and perception in the mode of causal efficacy. Because the picture book child points at the drawing and says dog. But then what do we do when we're reading with a child? We say, what does a dog say? What does the dog say? And the child goes, ruff, ruff, ruff. And there's so much richness in the barking. It's back in the throat where we don't even talk. And then there's those F's. Being a dog. And that's where poetry begins. A poem begins to happen as language bears its composition in the mode of causal efficacy, that a poem takes the thickness and edges of language itself and of time's passage and is an articulation of that. And we'll unpack that a little bit. But Audre Lorde, who was a lesbian feminist, Black, she called herself a warrior poet, has a beautiful book, Sister Outsider, of essays. And this is from one of them, Poetry is Not a Luxury. And what she's doing is she's defining perception as the quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are nameless and formless, birthed, that is brand new, but already felt. So poetry, there's two ways that a poem can embody perception in the mode of causal efficacy. And one of them is by its craft, which is how it uses language deliberately. And the other is by the poem is itself temporal. It's a causal passage that extends itself. So the word craft is what is often used for how a poem is honed or crafted. It's made and revised. And craft is also, of course, a boat and the means where we're carried over the waters from here to there. And poets have a whole toolbox of craft. They have the clarity of presentational immediacy in language that they can draw on that makes something clear and present tense usually. And then they also have lots of ways to turn to sort of tap into perception in the mode of causal efficacy. Some of those tools are syntax or grammar, which you can play with. You can even eliminate and just have spaces. Rhythm, repetition, sometimes rhyme. Sometimes the rhyme is very subtle. It's inside the lines. motion of the poem through itself by leaps of association, where you're not explaining how you get from here to there. It's like the kindergarten suddenly being in the stairwell. You don't have to make a story of how that happened. There's metaphor, there's the mouthfeel of certain words. So think about the word basket. And don't think about what they mean, just think about the words basket or root. And compare that to the words noun or digital era. They feel very different in the mouth. And that difference is actually where feeling and even emotion are carried in a poem. So basket, I said to forget what it means, but basket sounds like what it is, and so does root. Root is such a basic sound. It's like something that goes under things, root. So anyway, a poet can draw on that. And then also a poet can draw on the etymology of a word, which are the histories that come in and with words. They're like the layers of communal human memory in a word's evolution. And what they do is they're still felt, those histories, in a sort of valence with the word, and we don't even realize it in ordinary life. So like the pages of the child's book, well, they turn out to be a library book, which doesn't happen very often anymore, a library book that has pages that are worn soft because it's been read by many children. And the passage of time can be felt in the touch of those pages, touching those pages. And that's kind of like the way the passage of time can be felt in words that have been used through time. So like a potter has clay, poetry's medium is language. And language is crafted to carry experience to the reader. And this is what we get wrong sometimes about poetry. Even poets get it wrong. The poem is not about the poet's experience. The poem is about crafting language so that the reader has an experience. And that's where the joining of the poet and the reader happen. So the second way that it's related to this, that a poem embodies perception in the mode of causal efficacy, is that a poem is itself a passage of time in more than one way, like dance, other arts, most other arts, not all maybe, music. Poetry's an art that only exists as it passes through or inhabits time. You can't say a word without time. You can't write or read without time passing. So in itself, it's a temporal motion. But there's another kind of temporality, and this is related to causal efficacy too. Like the sounds, I think I forgot to say, like the sounds of basket and root tap into causal efficacy because they bring us outside of categories with the sound, with the so what this other kind of temporality is it's the extension to the reader, from the poem to the reader, and really from the poet to the reader, who is in a different time and place and is amid other memories and desires and a whole life. And by that meeting across time, which can be a long time, it could be centuries, could be tomorrow, could be a second. Causal efficacy is perceived. We perceive that time, I should say, by means of causal efficacy. And what we're perceiving is the relation between the poet and the reader, because there's time between them. And what's even more interesting is that because there are several or many readers, each who is bringing the poem into their own nest of a felt lifetime in their event of reading, this is happening sort of in a radiant way, really. And that is what the reason it's called causal efficacy is because that is the motion of cause of effects through extension. So I think the best way to understand that is to read part of this poem by Adrienne Rich. And it comes from a section of a really long poem, a section called Dedications. And the long poem is, it's beautiful. It's in a book called An Atlas of a Difficult World from, I think, 1991. So here's the poem. And think about the space between the I and the you being a temporal extension of something feeling, something vague, some need, lure between there. I know you are reading this poem late, before reading your office of the one intense yellow lamp spot and the darkening window in the lassitude of a building faded to quiet long after rush hour. I know you are reading this poem in a room where too much has happened for you to bear, where the bedclothes lie in stagnant coils on the bed, and the open valise speaks of flight, but you cannot leave yet. I know you are reading this poem as the underground train loses momentum, and before running up the stairs toward a new kind of love your life has never allowed. I know you are reading this poem as you pace beside the stove warming milk, a crying child on your shoulder, a book in your hand, because life is short and you too are thirsty. So one of the people who I think was getting at that kind of double temporality, that the past comes into the poem and then the poem reaches, extends, was Derrida, Jacques Derrida. And in an account of how signification, which is really meaning, occurs, he calls this carrying relation of past into present and out of present into future, but that it's happening all right now. He calls that vague thing that Whitehead calls causal efficacy. Derrida calls it the trace. And what I like about that is it has in it just sort of the fleetingness and the, a trace sort of has a part that's like thick, and then it thins out into nothing. So the present is in relation with what is no longer, and it's in relation with what is not yet. And it bears a trace that is in relation to memories of readers it has not yet met. So this is building a large sort of network of overlapping causalities and deep memories, and some of them are in language. So So that's poetry. And I think the question then is about thinking. Thinking with perception in the mode of causal efficacy. Like we're used to thinking a little bit more definitely than all this vague stuff. Although I have to say the number of times that Whitehead says the word vague or writes it in Process and Reality is huge. So if poetry can bear and offer experiences of perception that are in the mode of causal efficacy, can we tap into that mode, that huge mode where causality is riding, when we're thinking, including when we try to have theological thoughts or philosophical or analytical or political ideas? So then we have Whitehead popping in saying, but you cannot think without abstractions, which he ought to know. And I think he means by that we need that categorical point at the dog use of language and perception and the generality of abstractions, that even that kind of abstraction that we put over reality. So I just want to go back to Derrida for a minute because Derrida, who is known to be I'm not sure what, a complicated philosopher, he originally wanted to be a poet. He tried to be a poet. And here's what he wrote about that. My first inclination wasn't really toward philosophy, but rather towards literature, not, and he doesn't mean in a critical sense, he means in a making sense, rather towards literature, no, towards something that literature accommodates more easily than philosophy, something more. A yearning, so he's, I think, expressing that there's a yearning, and it goes through his philosophy, for something more, for mystery, for the massiveness of time that's carried in the light breeze. So Whitehead's project seems to be, at least in part, his whole project I'm talking about, and this is a big claim to make. To think, he's trying to think without excluding the felt immensity of causation through extension. So trying to think without excluding that felt intensity of causation through extension, through time in our day. So what most excites him, I think, are these fresh connections that he makes when he kind of insists on picking up this causal efficacy mode of perception. He says, philosophy needs to remove the diminutions in conventional phraseology, a mouthful, that, and I think that's like, if we stick to traditional dominant language, we are diminishing perception of that thickness of experiencing causal efficacy. He wants to, and this is a quote, move toward the vivid suggestiveness of the poet. The nudge that, I think he wants that nudge that poetry can give us into perception of time's vaguely felt passage, of embodiment within embodiment of memory. And he wants to make philosophy do that. So to suggest, to be suggestive like a poem, is not to build a system of concepts. And that's one thing I think that's important is I'm pretty sure he's not writing a system, but he's writing concepts that he's trying to keep open to this other mode. So to me, it seems like process and reality in particular is an attempt to philosophically think precisely the human experience of that inexact, massive background of relations. Because, and this is important, because that's what actually affects us. And the means by which what is new truly new, can emerge through new constellations coming together from things already related differently. So relational conjunctions of mutual cause and effect kind of bump into each other through time. And we feel that vaguely everywhere, maybe if we had a society that did that. It's sometimes very clear in giving birth or in dying, grief, pain, aging, the passage of time through a body, learning, exaltation. There's the necessity of extension in order to experience those things that truly move us. And one reason I think that thinking about this vague thing is truly important is because the ways we perceive belonging to the universe matter. We're really used to that mode of presentational immediacy because it habituates us to names and labels. And this is really true in the digital age, to privileging immediacy and simplicity. AI is a great example of I call it dumbing down. The language is repeated, and it's the most repeated language, so it's the simplest, most used language, and the rarer ways of saying things sort of filter out. And so does grammar that is difficult. And so that privileging of immediacy and simplicity is kind of like presentational immediacy gone berserk. And what that does is it's putting a sort of control of meaning over the precision of mattering. And Whitehead claims that knowing and speaking, chairs and tables and rocks and people, that way actually creates a loss, the most important loss of what makes us alive, which is our vividness. And then those objectifications don't just make the vividness disappear. The objectifications hide that loss. So in Modes of Thought, he writes, the abstraction may misdirect us as to the real complex from which it originates. And here's the kind of the good news. But in the dim recesses behind consciousness, there is the sense of realities behind abstractions. So those realities are extensive, extensive events in process. And then let's see, I'm going to skip the quote about rationalism. And just to say that perception in the mode of causal efficacy, it's not, and to try to think with it, that's not an anti-intellectual endeavor. A poem is not an anti-intellectual endeavor. Some poems are, when they stick to that representational simplicity in a way. But to work with and speak with and think with in ways that make room for causal efficacy, that is not anti-intellectualism. It's actually quite the opposite, because it requires a deeper complexity of thought and a wider sense of feeling that comes into the thought. So that temporal extension, it is the stuff of poetry and music and art, but it's also properly the stuff of what Whitehead calls the function of reason. He has a whole book about it. Speculative reason, which is his specialty, takes up a theoretical perspective that includes perception in the mode of causal efficacy. And people say it's hard to read Whitehead. That's why. Speculative reason includes apprehending the feeling forth of a layered temporality in and as its chaotic relations. So all of this is a widening of feeling, the experience and the language and the thinking and the poetry that is trying to get to this deep, deep causality. Perception in the mode of causal efficacy, it lets us feel in a particular way. We're feeling by our existence, not just as ourselves, but like at the march on Saturday. Part of the individual is not the individual, and yet the experience is within at the same time. So causal efficacy is letting us feel by our existence these extensions of internal relation. And by that, we know we are part of one another's lives. And that's a perspective that we need in order to consider truly the ways our lives are profoundly implicated in the lives of others. So by exercising this mode of perceiving, we live within each other's most intimate becomings, inseparably part of the suffering and the thriving within each other's lifetimes. So the widening memory and the future relational reach of the reader being in all these different lives, contexts, and relations, that allows us to realize that we are the result of, and we contribute to, fields of widely dispersed effects. So to live and to perceive living that way, it would, I think, create a different politics for sure, and different ways of conceiving of the loss of US aid, of conceiving and perceiving war, of perceiving, feeling the detainment of immigrants, not just sort of a surface feeling of the categories, but violences that are managed by playing language that not only refuses to admit perception in the mode of causal efficacy, but actively obscures what is most deeply alive in the world under manipulative abstractions. They are deadly. So this is Judith Butler. One way a hegemonic understanding of politics is achieved is to control the way in which people see, how they hear, what they see, to establish what will count as reality and what will not, whose lives can be marked as lives or count as deaths. Our capacity to feel and to apprehend hangs in the balance, but so too does the ability to think critically publicly about the effects. So coming close to concluding here, my favorite professor from my MDiv program at Harvard Divinity School was the theologian Richard R. Niebuhr, who was the son of Richard Niebuhr and the nephew of Reinhold Niebuhr, and a poor person. But he was the gentlest soul on earth and smart. And he reminds us, reminded me that one need not be a literal poet to be a human being who is honing their poetic abilities. So this is from his book, Streams of Grace. Poets are makers, and in making poems, they make themselves. We are all poets in this sense. We make ourselves, we create ourselves by the attitudes and responses we cultivate toward the social and natural worlds surrounding us. We need to attend to our responsibilities as poets. To become open or generous requires of us that we practice our poetic abilities. And then just a little bit of Michel Foucault, who also taps into this, especially at the end of his life. How must we take care of this principle of activity, the soul? So that's his take on what this connection between us that is bigger than us and lives in us is. He calls it soul. Is it too late then, I wonder? Is it too late? As a society that is dominated by non-benign technological drive and by an authoritarian, self-serving politics, is it too late to do the work of including in our communications in the public mode and with each other language of complexity and depth, illusion, ambiguity, suggestiveness, not just naming things and people, like tagging them, and summarizing their existence such that it's convenient in a little box. That's no way to understand changes in society or originality or like what enters the world and how that has been before and never been, valuing those vague, massive extensions of felt causes. Maybe we take care of the soul, not just our own soul, but the extensive soul of millions of hungry people, millions seeking education, millions ill, millions protesting, millions of trees, billions of plankton. Maybe the principle of activity, that soul, needs language. We all need language to delve further into widening the experience of relational, temporally extended existence. If we could do that, there's an opening of freedom and creativity and compassion. For Whitehead, God is the poet of the world, and maybe there is one extensive poem of infinitely different, shimmering, mysterious, but perceptible strands. And if so, care of the extensive soul needs human languages capable of sustaining the capacity to feel. I want to close just with this 2 lines where the title comes from. O sacred head now wounded. This is from 12th century because of the harmony of the with him way down. What language shall I borrow to love thee, dearest friend? Thank you.
Oh my, Christina, you have plunged us into warm waters, into troubled waters, and you've led us into a meadow of stars. Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. I'm aware that our time is almost over, and I want to say a huge thank you to you, Christina. This has been a splendid presentation, evocative, imagistically and conceptually and humanly. Thank you very much. I know you have something to share, and we now invite you to give your last word.
Sure. I want to say thank you actually for you listening to such a density of stuff. And also to Mary Elizabeth, just for giving me the chance to actually organize some of this thought that I've been having about language and its diminishments. And anyway, so this is a poem called Practicing the Saving. And I think I'll just leave it at that. It's not too long. I haven't thought of them for years, but I used to watch cheerleaders on a green field make of their bodies overpass and underpass, unsteadily use one another's palms and backs as rungs of a ladder, and then practice their basket toss, and like human wicker, quick weaving itself, or a net knotted by the grip of hands around wrists, they crisscrossed their arms for ropes. Over and over, the leaping one, throwing a self like an earnest ball, arced through the air and into the basket. Caught in a riptide, dragging them way out and under. 2 children were disappearing, though the waves seemed small. Their mother saw, ran and entered the water into the diagonal current, and weak swimmer, she rolled and was carried out. But faster than the end of this line, a human chain was forming. Hands joined at wrists. Strangers were trying to reach the children. The entire sunned crowd on its feet, so many running the chain through the water longer and longer, then lifting and passing the children one at a time back to the beach, then the mother. The family collapsed side by side, breathing. The chain pulling itself out of the sea. The links were people again. Sometimes, as a diverse species, we make of our bodies what we need, tools where nothing else can reach. I love people who make of their joined freedoms an apparatus against losing the irreplaceable. And the cheerleaders got it, so smoothly catching and rolling their human projectile out of the basket she popped onto her feet. The human chain, the glory of our species, public and indelible, we do know what to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.
Mhm.
And thanks to all of you for your wonderful participation.